The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged Afghan mountains as Team Bravo's helicopter descended toward the landing zone. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen pressed his face against the small window, watching the hostile terrain grow larger beneath them. The rocky valleys and steep ridges looked like a maze designed by nature to trap unwary soldiers. 2 minutes out, shouted the crew chief over the roar of the rotors. Marcus turned to his 5-man SEAL team, their faces painted with camouflage and eyes focused with the intensity that only came from countless missions in enemy territory. Each man carried over 60 pounds of gear, weapons, and ammunition. They had trained for this operation for weeks, but Afghanistan had a way of making even the best plans fall apart. Lieutenant Jake Sullivan, their team leader, held up 2 fingers and then pointed toward the ground. The universal signal meant they were almost at the drop point. At 28, Sullivan was younger than Marcus but had already earned respect through 3 deployments and a chest full of medals. His calm leadership had brought them through situations that should have killed them all. Petty Officer 2nd Class Tommy Rodriguez checked his rifle for the 10th time since takeoff. The stocky Marine from Texas never seemed nervous, but his constant weapon checks told a different story. Next to him, Hospital Corpsman David Kim reviewed his medical supplies one final time. At just 22, Kim was the youngest member of the team, but his steady hands had saved more lives than most doctors twice his age. Petty Officer 1st Class Alex Johnson, their communications specialist, tested his radio equipment. The tall, quiet man from Montana rarely spoke unless necessary, but when he did, everyone listened. His ability to maintain contact with base even in the worst conditions had saved their lives more times than they could count. The helicopter shuddered as it touched down in a cloud of dust and debris. The team moved with practiced efficiency, grabbing their gear and rushing toward the exit. Within 30 seconds, they were on the ground and moving toward cover as the helicopter lifted off behind them. The silence that followed the departure of their ride was almost deafening. After hours of engine noise, the sudden quiet of the mountains felt heavy and threatening. Marcus could hear his own breathing inside his helmet as the team took defensive positions behind a cluster of large rocks. Sullivan pulled out his map and compass, cross-referencing their position with the GPS coordinates they had memorized. Their mission was to locate and eliminate a high-value target known as the Ghost, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the region. Intelligence suggested the Ghost was hiding in a compound approximately 8 kilometers north of their current position. The plan was simple in concept but dangerous in execution. They would move through the mountains under cover of darkness, establish observation of the target compound, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. "Rodriguez, take point," Sullivan whispered into his headset. "Chen, you're with me. Kim and Johnson, watch our 6. The team began their movement up the rocky slope, each man maintaining visual contact with the others while scanning for threats. The terrain was even more challenging than it had appeared from the helicopter. Loose rocks threatened to give way under their boots, and the steep inclines tested their endurance despite their excellent physical condition. After 2 hours of careful movement, they reached a ridge that provided a good view of the valley below. Sullivan called for a short rest while he studied the landscape ahead through his binoculars. The intelligence briefing had mentioned several small villages in the area, but most were believed to be abandoned due to the ongoing conflict. "Movement, 2 o'clock, Rodriguez whispered into his radio. Everyone froze and followed his gaze toward a distant hillside. Through their scopes, they could see 3 figures moving along a goat path about 800 meters away. The figures appeared to be local shepherds, but, in this region, appearances could be deadly. "Could be spotters," Johnson observed quietly. Sullivan watched the figures for several minutes before making his decision. "They're heading away from our route. We continue as planned." The team resumed their movement, following a series of ridges that would keep them hidden from the villages below. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and, despite their training, the combination of heat, altitude, and heavy gear began to take its toll. By late afternoon, they had covered 6 of the 8 kilometers to their target. Sullivan called for an extended rest in the shade of a large boulder formation. The men drank water and ate energy bars while maintaining watch in all directions. Kim treated several minor cuts and scrapes that the team had collected during their climb. The rocky terrain was unforgiving, and even the smallest injury could become infected in the harsh environment.
How much further to the observation point? Rodriguez asked, wiping sweat from his forehead.
Sullivan checked his map again.
About 2 clicks.
We should reach it by nightfall if we maintain this pace. As they prepared to move out again, Johnson held up his hand for silence. His radio had crackled with an incoming message from their base of operations. The team gathered around as he adjusted his equipment to improve reception.
Bravo team, this is Eagle Base. We have new intelligence on your target area. Multiple heat signatures detected around the primary objective.
Recommend extreme caution.
Over.
Sullivan took the radio handset.
Eagle Base, this is Bravo 6. How many signatures are we talking about?
Over.
Bravo 6, initial count shows approximately 15 to 20 personnel in and around the compound.
Significantly more than original estimates.
Do you want to abort?
Over. The team exchanged glances. Their original intelligence had suggested no more than 5 or 6 enemy combatants at the target location.
20 hostile fighters completely changed the tactical situation. Negative, Eagle Base.
Mission continues as planned.
We'll adapt to the new intelligence. Bravo 6 out. Rodriguez shook his head. 20 bad guys? That's not a capture mission anymore, LT. That's a suicide mission.
We don't know for sure what we're dealing with yet, Sullivan replied.
Could be a family gathering, could be a meeting of commanders. We'll observe and adapt. Marcus checked his ammunition again. Each man carried 300 rounds of rifle ammunition, plus grenades and other explosive devices. Against 20 determined fighters in a fortified position, their firepower advantage would disappear quickly. The team resumed their movement as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The rocky terrain became even more treacherous in the fading light, but they needed to reach their observation point before full darkness made movement impossible. An hour before sunset, they finally reached a ridge that overlooked their target area. The compound sat in a small valley about 1,500 meters below their position. Through their binoculars and spotting scopes, they could see why the intelligence reports had been so concerning. The compound was much larger than expected, consisting of several buildings surrounded by high walls. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and multiple vehicles were parked outside the main gate. This was not the small hideout they had been expecting to find. Count 12 guards visible from this angle, Marcus reported quietly. And that's just what we can see, Johnson added. Could be twice that many inside the buildings?
Sullivan studied the compound through his scope, noting guard positions, patrol patterns, and potential approach routes. The mission was rapidly becoming more complex than their original planning had anticipated. As darkness fell, they established a hidden observation post among the rocks and began detailed surveillance of the target. They would watch through the night, gathering intelligence and waiting for the right opportunity to strike. What they didn't know was that their own presence had already been detected. High above them on an even more distant ridge, a lone figure watched them through a powerful scope, counting their numbers and reporting their position to others hidden in the darkness. The hunter had become the hunted, but they wouldn't discover this until it was almost too late. Around midnight, Kim noticed something that made his blood run cold.
LT, we've got a problem.
Sullivan crawled over to Kim's position and followed his gaze. In the valley below, new vehicles were arriving at the compound. As they watched, armed men poured out of trucks and began taking positions around the perimeter. "They know we're here," Rodriguez whispered. The trap was being set, and Team Bravo was about to find themselves surrounded by an enemy that had been expecting them all along. The mission to capture the Ghost was about to become a desperate fight for survival in the unforgiving Afghan mountains. Sullivan made the hardest decision of his military career. Instead of calling for extraction, he chose to continue the mission. They had come too far and risked too much to abandon their objective now. But, as the night wore on and more enemy fighters arrived in the valley below, it became clear that their simple capture mission had turned into something far more dangerous.
They were no longer hunters stalking their prey. They were prey themselves, surrounded by an enemy that seemed to know their every move before they made it. And, somewhere in the darkness above them, a concealed marksman was preparing to make their situation infinitely worse. The real test of their training and brotherhood was about to begin. Dawn broke over the Afghan mountains with deceptive beauty, painting the rocky peaks in shades of gold and orange. But, for Team Bravo, huddled in their observation post among the boulders, the sunrise brought only the grim realization that their situation had deteriorated throughout the night. Marksman had drawn the last watch, and, through his scope, he counted at least 30 armed fighters now positioned around the compound below. What had started as a straightforward capture mission was rapidly becoming their worst nightmare. "LT, you need to see this," Marcus whispered into his radio. Sullivan crawled carefully to Marcus's position, staying low to avoid detection. Through his binoculars, he watched as more vehicles arrived at the compound. Armed men emerged and began setting up what appeared to be heavy weapons positions. "Machine gun nests," Sullivan observed grimly. "They're preparing for a fight." Rodriguez joined them, his face grim. "Think they made us?" Before Sullivan could answer, Johnson's voice crackled over their radio from his communications position. "Boss, I'm picking up radio chatter. They know we're up here somewhere. They're organizing search teams." The realization hit the team like a physical blow. Somehow, their presence had been compromised. Either they had been spotted during their movement or there had been a leak in their operational security. Kim, still monitoring the medical supplies, looked up with concern. "If they send search teams up here, we'll be sitting ducks. This position gives us good observation, but there's nowhere to retreat." Sullivan studied their tactical map, looking for alternative positions or escape routes. The terrain around their current location was steep and rocky, with limited cover. Moving during daylight would expose them to observation from below, but staying put might mean being surrounded and captured. "Options?" Sullivan asked his team. "We could try to move north along the ridgeline," Marcus suggested. "There's a secondary valley about 3 clicks that way. Might give us better concealment. Or we could go ahead with the mission," Rodriguez added. "Take out as many of them as possible before they find us." Johnson shook his head. "With 30+ hostiles down there? We'd be outnumbered 6-1. Sullivan considered their choices, all of which seemed equally dangerous. As he was about to make his decision, Kim grabbed his arm and pointed toward the compound. "Movement at the main building. Someone's coming out." Through their scopes, they watched as a figure emerged from the central building of the compound. Even at a distance of 1,500 meters, Sullivan recognized him from the intelligence photos they had studied during mission preparation. "That's him," Sullivan whispered. "That's the ghost." The man they had traveled so far to find stood in the compound's courtyard, apparently giving instructions to his fighters. He was smaller than Sullivan had expected, but there was an unmistakable air of authority in his movements. "We have eyes on target," Sullivan reported quietly into his radio. "Confirming identity of primary objective." The ghost spoke with several of his men before pointing directly toward the ridge where Team Bravo was hidden. Even from their distant position, the SEALs could see him gesturing toward the high ground around their location. "He knows exactly where we are," Marcus said quietly. As if to confirm their fears, armed men began emerging from the compound and forming into search teams. Some headed north along the valley floor, while others began climbing the steep slopes toward the ridge. "Time to go," Sullivan decided. "We move north along the ridge, try to find a better position." The team began packing their equipment with practiced efficiency, but, as they prepared to move, Johnson held up his hand for silence. His radio was receiving another transmission from their base. "Bravo team, this is Eagle Base. Be advised, we have lost contact with your extraction helicopter. Last known position was approximately 20 minutes from your location. Over." Sullivan felt his stomach drop. Without their planned extraction, they were stranded in hostile territory with enemy forces closing in from multiple directions. "Eagle Base, what happened to our ride?" Over. "Unknown at this time, Bravo 6. possible mechanical failure or hostile action. We're working on alternative extraction options. Maintain your position if possible. Over. Negative on maintaining position, Eagle Base. We have been compromised and are taking fire. Moving to alternate location. Will contact when secure. Bravo 6 out. The team began their movement along the ridge, staying low and using every available piece of cover. The rocky terrain that had seemed so challenging during their initial approach now became their ally, providing concealment from the search teams below. But, as they moved, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. High above them, on an even more distant ridge, he caught a brief reflection of sunlight off glass or metal. Sniper, Marcus hissed into his radio. High ground, northeast, approximately 2,000 meters. The team immediately took cover behind the nearest rocks. A concealed marksman in an elevated position could make their movement across the open ridge impossible. Can you get a shot? Sullivan asked. Marcus studied the distant position through his scope. Negative. Too far, and I can't get a clear line of sight from here. They were trapped between the search teams climbing toward them from below and a sniper positioned on the high ground above. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. We need to move before those search teams reach us, Rodriguez urged. Sullivan made a quick decision. Smoke grenades. We lay down concealment and move fast. Johnson, call for immediate extraction from anywhere that can take us. Already on it, boss. But it's going to take time. The team prepared their smoke grenades while keeping watch on both the approaching search teams and the sniper position above. They would have only minutes to cross the exposed section of ridge before the smoke cleared. On my mark, Sullivan said. 3, 2, 1, mark. The SEALs threw their smoke grenades simultaneously, creating a thick gray cloud that obscured their position. They immediately began moving north along the ridge, staying low and moving as fast as the rocky terrain would allow. The concealed sniper had been waiting for exactly this moment. As the smoke began to billow across the ridge, he adjusted his scope and prepared to fire. From his elevated position, he could track their movement even through the concealment. The first shot rang out just as Marcus reached a gap between two large boulders. The bullet struck the rock inches from his head, sending stone fragments flying. The SEALs immediately dove for cover, but they were caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Sniper fire! Sniper fire! Rodriguez yelled into his radio. More shots followed in rapid succession, each one precisely aimed and dangerously close. The marksman was clearly a professional, possibly a former military sniper fighting with the Taliban forces. Kim was treating a minor wound on Johnson's arm from rock fragments when another shot rang out. This one struck even closer, demonstrating that their concealment was rapidly deteriorating. We can't stay here, Marcus called out. He's got us zeroed in. Sullivan assessed their situation with growing urgency. The search teams were still climbing toward them from below, the sniper had them pinned down from above, and their extraction was delayed indefinitely. Bounding over watch, Sullivan decided. Rodriguez and Chen provide covering fire while Kim, Johnson, and I move to that rock formation 30 meters north. Then, we switch. It was a dangerous plan, but remaining stationary under sniper fire would be suicide. The team prepared to execute the movement, knowing that they would be exposed for several crucial seconds. Covering fire, now! Sullivan shouted. Rodriguez and Marcus began firing toward the sniper position, not expecting to hit their target at such range, but hoping to disrupt his aim. Sullivan, Kim, and Johnson sprinted toward the next piece of cover. The sniper's next shot came just as they reached safety, missing Johnson by inches. The marksman was incredibly skilled, adjusting for their movement and maintaining accuracy despite the return fire. Now it was Rodriguez and Marcus's turn to move. They sprinted across the open ground while their teammates provided covering fire. Another sniper round cracked overhead, but both men reached cover safely. They had gained 30 meters, but they were still far from safety. The search teams below were getting closer, and the sniper continued to track their every movement. "Boss, I've got contact with a helicopter," Johnson reported breathlessly. "But, it's going to be at least 30 minutes before they can reach us." 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours.
At their current rate of movement under fire, the search teams would reach them long before extraction arrived. Sullivan made another difficult decision.
"We go on the offensive.
Take out those search teams before they reach us."
"What about the sniper?" Kim asked. "We deal with him too."
Rodriguez, you and Marcus set up to engage the sniper.
"Kim and Johnson, you're with me. We're going down to meet those search teams."
It was a desperate plan, but sometimes desperate situations called for aggressive action.
Instead of continuing to retreat, they would attack their pursuers and try to eliminate the immediate threats.
The team split into two groups and prepared to execute Sullivan's plan. They had trained for situations exactly like this, but training and reality were two very different things. As they prepared to move, the sniper fired again. This shot was different, aimed not at them but at their equipment.
The radio antenna on Johnson's pack exploded in a shower of sparks and debris. "Communications are down," Johnson yelled.
Now they were truly isolated, cut off from their base and their extraction, surrounded by enemies who seemed to know their every move. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, and Team Bravo prepared to fight for their lives in the unforgiving Afghan mountains. The real battle was just beginning, and they were about to discover that their enemies had been planning this trap for much longer than anyone had imagined. The morning air was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the distant shouts of enemy fighters as Team Bravo prepared to execute their desperate plan. With their communications severed by the concealed sniper, they were truly on their own in the hostile Afghan mountains. Sullivan gathered his men behind a large boulder formation that provided temporary cover from both the sniper above and the search teams below. The tactical situation was unlike anything they had faced in their previous deployments, but their training had prepared them for the impossible. "Listen up," Sullivan whispered urgently.
"Rodriguez and Chen, you move to that outcropping about 50 meters east. Get elevation and engage that sniper.
Don't worry about hitting him at that range, just keep him busy and disrupt his shots." Marcus checked his rifle scope settings while Rodriguez gathered extra ammunition. Taking on a sniper at over 2,000 meters with standard infantry weapons was nearly impossible, but they only needed to buy time for the rest of the team.
"Kim and Johnson, you're with me.
We're going to flank those search teams and hit them before they reach our position."
"Questions?" Kim adjusted his medical gear to allow for better movement. "What's our rally point if we get separated?" Sullivan pointed to a distant ridge to the north. "That's saddle between the two peaks.
We meet there in 2 hours regardless of what happens here." The team prepared to split up, each man checking his weapons and equipment one final time. They had worked together for over 2 years, and, despite the desperate nature of their situation, there was a calm professionalism in their movements. "Good hunting," Rodriguez said quietly as he and Marcus prepared to move toward their sniper position. Sullivan watched his men move across the rocky terrain with practiced stealth. Even under fire and surrounded by enemies, they maintained the discipline and tactical awareness that had kept them alive through countless dangerous missions. Marcus and Rodriguez reached their position and immediately began setting up for long-range shooting. The sniper's location was barely visible as a dark shadow among the rocks on the distant ridge, but they could track his movement by watching for muzzle flashes when he fired. Range is about 2,200 meters, Marcus calculated, adjusting his scope for the extreme distance.
Wind is light and variable from the northeast.
Rodriguez set up as his spotter, using binoculars to observe the target area.
"I see him.
He's moving between two positions, probably has them pre-planned for exactly this kind of engagement." Meanwhile, Sullivan led Kim and Johnson down the slope toward the approaching search teams. The enemy fighters were climbing steadily but carelessly, apparently confident that their sniper had the Americans pinned down. Through his binoculars, Sullivan counted 8 men in the closest search team. They were armed with AK-47 assault rifles and moving in a loose formation that showed both confidence and inexperience with actual combat.
"We take them from above," Sullivan decided.
"Johnson, you're our base of fire. Kim and I will flank left and hit them from the side. Johnson found a good position among some rocks that gave him a clear field of fire down the slope. The enemy fighters were still 400 meters away, well within effective range of their weapons. Kim and Sullivan began moving to their flanking position, using the rocky terrain for concealment. The morning sun was climbing higher, and the heat was beginning to build, but adrenaline kept them focused and alert. Back at the sniper position, Marcus was preparing to take his first shot when Rodriguez grabbed his arm. "Wait. Look at the compound." Marcus shifted his scope to observe the valley below. More vehicles were arriving, and he could see fighters taking positions throughout the area. What had started as a simple capture mission was revealing itself to be something much larger. "This whole thing was a setup," Rodriguez said quietly. "They knew we were coming." The realization was chilling but not entirely surprising. Intelligence leaks and compromised operations were unfortunate realities in modern warfare. But understanding that they had walked into a trap didn't change their immediate tactical situation. "Snipers moving again," Rodriguez reported. "He's trying to get a better angle on the boss and Kim." Marcus tracked the movement through his scope and fired his first shot. The bullet struck rocks near the sniper's position, sending up a shower of stone fragments. It wasn't a hit, but it served notice that the Americans were fighting back. The enemy sniper immediately returned fire, his shot striking dangerously close to Marcus's position. The marksman was indeed a professional, possibly trained by Russian or Chinese military advisors. "Keep him busy," Rodriguez urged. "The boss is about to make his move." Down the slope, Sullivan and Kim had reached their flanking position. The enemy search team was now only 200 meters away and climbing directly into their ambush. The fighters were talking loudly among themselves, apparently unconcerned about operational security. Sullivan keyed his short-range radio. "Johnson, on my signal, open fire. Kim and I will hit them from the left flank." "Roger that," Johnson replied from his overwatch position. Sullivan watched the enemy fighters climb closer, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their ambush. In Afghanistan, timing was everything. Too early, and they might miss some of the fighters. Too late, and the enemy might detect their presence. "Now!" Sullivan shouted. Johnson opened fire with controlled bursts, his shots striking the lead fighters before they could react. Kim and Sullivan attacked from the flank, their rifles adding to the devastating surprise assault. The enemy search team was caught completely off guard. Several fighters fell immediately, while others scrambled for cover among the rocks. But these were experienced Taliban fighters, not raw recruits, and they recovered quickly from the initial shock. Return fire began almost immediately, forcing the SEALs to take cover. The enemy fighters had superior numbers and were fighting on familiar terrain. What had started as an ambush quickly became a firefight. "Grenades!" Kim shouted, pulling the pin from a fragmentation grenade and hurling it toward the enemy position. The explosion echoed across the mountainside, followed by screams and shouts in Pashto. But more enemy fighters were already moving to reinforce their teammates, and the tactical advantage was shifting. High above, Marcus was engaged in his own deadly duel with the concealed sniper. Each shot from the enemy marksman came closer to finding its target, while Marcus struggled to return effective fire at the extreme range. "He's good," Marcus admitted grimly. "Professional training, probably foreign military." Rodriguez continued to spot for him while monitoring the firefight below. "Boss needs help. There are more fighters coming up the slope." Marcus adjusted his scope and began engaging the reinforcing enemy fighters. At shorter range, his shots were more effective, and several Taliban fighters fell as they tried to reach the main battle. But the enemy had more resources to draw upon. From the compound below, additional search teams were beginning to climb toward the ridge. Team Bravo was facing the possibility of being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Sullivan realized their situation was becoming untenable. "Kim, Johnson, we need to move. More hostiles coming up the slope." The three SEALs began a fighting withdrawal, using fire and movement to break contact with the enemy search team. But, as they retreated, they discovered their path was blocked by another group of fighters approaching from the north.
"We're surrounded," Johnson reported grimly.
Sullivan assessed their tactical situation with growing concern. They were caught between multiple enemy forces, under fire from a skilled sniper, and cut off from their extraction. Their ammunition was limited, and they had no way to call for support. "Marcus, Rodriguez, we need covering fire for a breakout attempt," Sullivan radioed.
"Roger that, boss. We see the situation."
Marcus shifted his fire to the enemy fighters blocking their retreat route. His shots forced the Taliban fighters to take cover, creating a brief opportunity for Sullivan's team to move.
"Go! Go! Go!" Sullivan shouted.
The three SEALs sprinted across open ground toward a rock formation that might provide better defensive positions. Enemy bullets kicked up dust around their feet as they ran, but all three reached cover safely.
However, their new position only provided temporary safety.
Enemy fighters were now approaching from three different directions, and the concealed sniper continued to track their movements from his elevated position. Kim checked their ammunition situation and found it was worse than expected. "We're down to about 60 rounds per man, plus grenades." That was enough for a short firefight, but not for a prolonged engagement against superior numbers.
They needed to find a way to break contact and reach their rally point, but every avenue of escape seemed to be covered by enemy forces. "Options?" Sullivan asked his team.
"We could try to take out the sniper," Johnson suggested. "Without him tracking us, we might be able to break contact. Or we go straight at the compound," Marcus radioed from his position.
"Take the fight to them and try to complete the mission." Both options were extremely dangerous, but continuing to play defense would only delay the inevitable.
They needed to take aggressive action to change their tactical situation. Sullivan made his decision just as enemy fighters began closing in from multiple directions. The mountain air filled with the sound of automatic weapons fire as Team Bravo prepared to fight the most important battle of their military careers. The concealed sniper adjusted his scope one more time, preparing to deliver what he hoped would be the decisive shot. But he didn't know that Marksman had finally gotten a clear sight picture of his position and was preparing to return the favor. The real test of their training, teamwork, and determination was about to begin in earnest. The crack of rifles echoed across the Afghan mountains as Team Bravo fought for their lives against overwhelming odds. Enemy fighters were closing in from three directions, and the concealed sniper continued his deadly work from the high ridge above. But the SEALs had not survived countless missions by giving up when the situation looked hopeless. Marksman steadied his breathing and aligned his crosshairs with the distant muzzle flash from the enemy sniper's position. At over 2,000 meters, the shot was at the absolute limit of his rifle's effective range, but he had no choice but to try. "Wind is shifting," Rodriguez observed, watching through his binoculars. 2 clicks left, 1 click up." Marcus made the adjustments and took up the trigger slack. He would have only one chance before the sniper relocated to a different position.
Everything depended on this single shot.
The rifle bucked against his shoulder as he fired. For what seemed like an eternity, he watched through his scope as the bullet traveled across the vast distance. Then, he saw a brief spray of rock fragments from the sniper's position.
"Hit!" Rodriguez shouted. "You got him."
The deadly accurate fire from the ridge above suddenly stopped. Whether Marcus had wounded or killed the enemy marksman was unclear, but the immediate threat had been neutralized. Down the slope, Sullivan's team was engaged in a vicious firefight with the Taliban forces trying to surround them. Kim was treating a bullet wound in Johnson's leg while maintaining defensive fire toward the approaching enemies.
"How bad?" Sullivan asked, still firing controlled bursts at the enemy fighters.
"Through and through," Kim replied while bandaging the wound. "He can still move, but we need to get out of here soon." Sullivan assessed their ammunition situation and realized they were down to their last magazines. They had been fighting for over an hour, and their resources were nearly exhausted. "Marcus, Rodriguez, we need extraction support now." Sullivan radioed to his sniper team.
"Roger that, boss. We're moving to a better position to provide covering fire."
Marcus and Rodriguez began moving along the ridge toward a position that would give them better angles on the enemy forces surrounding their teammates. But, as they moved, Rodriguez spotted something that changed everything.
"Boss, you need to know this. I count at least 50 fighters moving up from the compound. This is bigger than we thought." The realization that they were facing an entire company of enemy fighters was sobering. Even with their superior training and equipment, 5 SEALs could not fight 50 Taliban fighters in a straight engagement. Sullivan made a desperate decision.
"We're going to have to break contact and run for the rally point. Johnson, can you move?"
"I can move," Johnson replied grimly, testing his wounded leg.
"Kim, give him whatever painkillers you can spare.
We're about to move fast and hard."
Kim injected Johnson with a dose of morphine that would dull the pain but keep him alert. It was a risky decision, but their situation left no room for conservative medical treatment.
Sullivan prepared smoke grenades to cover their withdrawal.
They would have only minutes to reach the rally point before the enemy forces converged on their position. "Marcus, Rodriguez, lay down covering fire when you see our smoke."
"We're making a run for it."
"Roger that, boss.
We'll keep them busy."
Sullivan pulled the pins from 3 smoke grenades simultaneously, throwing them in different directions to create maximum confusion. As the gray smoke began to billow across the rocky slope, the 3 SEALs began their desperate sprint toward safety.
Marcus and Rodriguez opened fire on the enemy positions, forcing the Taliban fighters to take cover just as Sullivan's team emerged from their concealment.
The coordination was perfect, but the distance to safety was over 800 meters of open terrain. Johnson ran on his wounded leg with grim determination, keeping pace with his teammates despite the pain. Kim stayed close to him, ready to provide support if he faltered. Sullivan led the way, using his knowledge of the terrain to find the best route through the rocky obstacles. Enemy bullets whistled past them as they ran, but the covering fire from Marcus and Rodriguez kept most of the fighters pinned down. Still, several enemy marksmen had found good positions and were placing accurate fire uncomfortably close to the fleeing SEALs.
"Contact front!"
Sullivan shouted as he spotted enemy fighters positioned directly across their escape route. The Taliban had anticipated their movement and positioned a blocking force to prevent their escape. Team Bravo was caught in the open with enemies both behind and ahead of them.
"Left! Left! Left!"
Sullivan yelled, changing direction toward a steep ravine that might provide temporary cover. The team changed course just as a burst of automatic fire swept across their previous path. They reached the ravine and slid down its steep sides, using the natural terrain to break visual contact with their pursuers. But the ravine was a double-edged sword. While it provided concealment from direct fire, it also channeled their movement and made them predictable to the enemy forces tracking them. "This ravine leads north toward the rally point," Sullivan observed, checking his map.
"But they'll be expecting us to follow it.
What choice do we have?"
Kim asked, still monitoring Johnson's condition.
Before Sullivan could answer, Rodriguez's voice crackled over their radio.
"Boss, you've got major problems.
Large force moving to cut off the ravine about 600 meters ahead of your position." The enemy was indeed thinking tactically, using their superior numbers to control the terrain and limit the SEALs' options. Team Bravo was being herded like animals toward what would likely be a final ambush.
"Marcus, Rodriguez, what's your status?"
Sullivan asked.
"We're moving to support, but there are fighters climbing up to our position too.
We're about to have our own problems." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly.
All 5 SEALs,